you. In the international community, Kenya is viewed as a beacon, particularly in political stability and modern advances in the African subregion, especially when it comes to economic progress. But for many citizens of Kenya, the reality within the borders of the country completely defies this distinction, and this is especially true for women. In politics, for example, Kenyan women are recognized for helping keep the peace in nations at war in the region, but at the same time, they have a global reputation for experiencing violence and brutality in their own political system. Tribal clashes, violence between opposing candidates and their representatives, endemic corruption, threats, intimidation, post-election violence, these are all part of the political landscape in Kenya. And while these factors are most evident during election campaigns, they are symptomatic of the nature of power within the Kenyan political structure and Kenyan culture in general. And the journey for women who seek political prowess in the country is almost insurmountable, more so when you consider the many forms of gender bias that women who run for office are forced to endure. Kenya is also a viciously patriarchal society, and of course, patriarchy and power go hand in hand. And that patriarchy is deeply entrenched, not just in terms of masculine privilege, but also in terms of the politics of money and legacy. The system is stacked in favor of those who own, inherit, and finance Kenya's political parties, and more often than not, their agendas dictate the internal workings of the political process. That in itself gravely undermines the intent of a democratic society, including the mandate for equal representation, as is the case with women seeking positions in government. Ernest?
One would expect that in a country where women have boisterously displayed their intention to contribute to the discourse of the day and to development, they should be supported in this mission. So, are there any legal provisions that help to curb such undermining of women and their aspirations to rise to political positions, Noella?
Yes. In 2010, a new constitution was adopted. One of the most celebrated amendments of that constitution is the two-thirds gender rule, which requires that no more than two-thirds of any political body may be occupied by one gender. And since then, Kenya has seen a dramatic rise in the number of women running for office. But because their campaigns have been met with unrelenting attacks and gender-based violence, the actual number of women in government remains low and is nowhere near the constitutional requirement. In the last general election in 2017, for example, we saw only 23 women elected out of 290 contested seats in the National Assembly, and just 3 women won Senate seats of the contested 47. And the voting public is not blameless. Patriarchal ideology in Kenya is extremely hostile to women. It is still influenced by tribal tradition and is rooted in these traditional gender roles that see women as property, owned and parceled out by the men in their lives, that they belong in the home, cooking and cleaning, always subversive and obedient, fulfilling their sacred duty to bear children in honor of their husbands' legacies. Furthermore, violence against women is rampant. And despite the fact that there are many laws that prohibit it, it still does go unpunished. And this is a daily reality for women across the country, but particularly in rural areas. Ernest?
Naturally, when pushed to the wall, the tendency is to react, if not to forcefully claim recognition, at least to defend their integrity and their empower or endorsements, which their male counterparts know about, but wouldn't want to overly acknowledge. So, are there any efforts in battling to make their voices heard, Noelia?
Well, In response to the pushback against women vying for political office, the country has witnessed many organized protests and marches that were led by women and women's organizations who understand that the lack of representation in parliament directly impacts the neglect of women's issues in society. Issues like education for girls, literacy and job training, pre and postnatal health care, the protection of sex workers, the enforcement of laws on gender-based violence, economic equality and empowerment, and more recently, the alarming rise in cases of femicide in the country. And when we talk about the political arena in Kenya, it is important to recognize that political activism is a key function of the political space. It is through activism, having been legislated out of or otherwise blocked from official parliamentary participation, that women in Kenya have dominated the political scene. The most prominent example would be a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Wangari Maathai, founder of the Green Belt movement and a pioneer in environmental activism in Kenya. Her journey as both an environmental and political activist is a harrowing story and an inspiring one. Another example is Anne Njogu, whose work on gender and sex-based violence in Kenya led to the Sexual Offences Act, which came into law in 2006, or Judy Thongori, a prominent lawyer who sits on the board of several organizations working towards girls' and women's rights in the country. Another would be Rebecca Lolosoli, who created a village in Samburu, a town in northern Kenya, to house victims fleeing sexual violence, a village which completely forbids men within its boundaries. So while the political body in Kenya continues to position itself in opposition to the advancement of women in politics, women across the country have found ways to impact the political process, the legislature, and the judiciary. They continue to run for office, but also create spaces for the empowerment of women. And these spaces are creating a path to power for the women to come.
A path to power for the women to come. Kenya's women then making frantic efforts to rise to political power and make their voices heard as well. Across the world, it's the same thing. Women are coming up just so they can tell their own stories. If they're able to manage the home properly and they've been acclaimed for that, why can't they manage positions in the administration? We hope that more of such women will come up, and why not transform Africa? We live in a world where men have not been the best, as a matter of fact. So maybe women could change the narrative. Noella, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you, Ernest.
We will be back with you next week.